it really is the case that knowledge, or in this case, data, is power. And what the scholar Shoshana Zuboff has memorably termed surveillance capitalism has driven the commercial success and profitability of advertising platforms such as Facebook, Google, Twitter. What do they know about us? How do they use our data? Some of you raised questions about the terms of service, and although few people in practice read them, they are an unsettling source of information that too few of us really consider. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. Others asked, what about the impact on human rights? We're engaged, we're in the middle of a massive societal experiment in which we are trading our privacy in return for free services. Now, privacy and freedom of expression are the obvious examples of rights that are impacted, are human rights that are impacted by these platforms. They're the sort of stars that hog the limelight. But other scholars, such as Chatham House's Kate Jones in a really excellent paper, also prompt us to consider freedom of thought and opinion. If your online experience is so mediated, if you're invisibly nudged towards information that's been selected to appeal to you, or that the platform's algorithmically determined profile of you, how freely determined are your thoughts or opinions, really? Other human rights aspect that's also often overlooked is the plight of the humans who are engaged in what's called commercial content moderation. They are the people who decide what stays up and what gets taken down on the major platforms that we're using. And research by scholars like Sarah T. Roberts uncovers a really grim world of PTSD suffering individuals compelled to watch beheadings, child abuse, and puppies beaten to death day in, day out. Who decides what content is taken down and how? It's a hidden world with little accountability or transparency. The online environment is increasingly politicized and geopoliticized, and several of you brought that out in your comments and questions. There are different actors leading in different geographies. So if you look at emerging technologies, for example, quantum or artificial intelligence, in the US, it's the private sector and academia that are leading the way. In China, it's the government. And if you're not already familiar, do look up the role of drones disguised as pigeons, which are using facial technology to identify members of the Uyghur community in China, or the way that the Chinese social credit system can impact on an individual's ability to travel and have other social benefits if they get marks against their character. And that's before coronavirus. Some of you asked what other actors are involved in this ecosystem that we're not talking about, and that's a really interesting question to think about. So there are lots of data intermediaries with names you've probably never heard of, but which are tracking you on every website you visit, correlating data about you from multiple sources, and deeply embedded in systems such as real-time bidding for advertising. Last year, the UK's privacy regulator, the Information Commissioner, published a report, again, that's pretty grim reading about real-time bidding. Unfortunately, their decision to do nothing about this ecosystem is disappointing because the use of data, is highly questionable in some circumstances. But I think it is worth reflecting that there is more to the internet than social media. And often overlooked is the role of major and minor actors in the web environment whose resources, whose services are used and abused, and who help in some cases, maybe unwittingly, to fund sources of disinformation or other information through advertising. So in closing this introduction, I just thought it would be useful and topical for us to consider a worked example of the way that data is collected and processed, I'm going to take the UK's new coronavirus tracking application and compare it with the sort of plain vanilla version of Facebook, and also an app which was for a torch or flashlight, if in the American terminology. So an app, a phone app that you could download from the App Store, and it does literally one thing, or it's supposed to do one thing, which is to shine a torch. This is going back to 2013, that analysis. But so the UK coronavirus tracking app is one of many, brought out by different countries in response to the pandemic to help to mitigate its spread, identify people who are suffering from symptoms, and help others who've been in contact with them to understand potential risk or exposure. So quite controversially, the UK has chosen what's called a centralised model. There's a whole debate about whether to decentralise or centralise the tracking apps, and we can discuss the implications of those in questions if you like. But, actually looking at the papers published, and there are extensive information published about the UK's tracking app, there are quite a few interesting aspects to it. The code is made open source. That doesn't mean that everybody can run it, but it means that tech boffins from all over the world and are getting all over its code, its security, its vulnerabilities, its functionality, and really able to understand it in a very transparent way. They're reporting bugs, they're reporting strange behavior, and so on. And there's quite a sort of an ongoing dialogue between themselves and the developers. The app has been developed in close coordination with both the UK's privacy regulator and its cybersecurity experts who are part of the intelligence services. So in theory, at least, it should be best practice in cybersecurity and best practice in data protection at the same time. For me, as a data protection person, as a lawyer, I'm very interested in the choices that the app has made about what data it collects and how long it's kept, because really that is getting things at the source and making sure that you're not collecting more than you should. So there's no location data that's going to be collected. There are temporary multi-layered IDs, so you're never persistently identified as a user of the app. Those are rotated at least every 24 hours, and it's only really when you choose to report your systems to the back-end database that you are identified. And there's also separation in the permissions between the app provider and the database provider. So great, but what about the third-party partners? Why is Palantir, a company that was involved in the setting up of Cambridge Analytica, notorious by now, why is that company involved? What is their role? How will others use and abuse the app? I mean, you can well imagine that, if you were a health insurer, for example, you might choose to make your wellness app interface with the government's COVID tracking so that you can pass on that information and incidentally collect it on the way. So what happens in the app stays in the app, but there's nothing to prevent others from sort of sitting on one side or the other and using or abusing the data. So that's the app. Let's compare it with Facebook and the Torchlight. Now, in Facebook, you have a highly centralized black box. Nobody knows what the code is. Nobody's allowed to access it. You can get certain limited permissions through technical APIs. But if you look at the terms of service of Facebook, you agree that Facebook will be tracking your location and given unlimited access to all your content, whether that's published on your page, in groups, or in private chat. There's actually no mention of how long the data is kept, probably forever, unless you as an individual ask for it to be deleted. Then they have to legally delete it and fish it out. But there's also been concerns about, is there sharing of data between WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook, all owned by Facebook? How does that all work? And when you sign up to use Facebook, you agree that they are allowed to share your data, not just for law enforcement if you commit a crime, but also for third parties, including their advertisers. And there's no way for you to opt out of that. And I mentioned the Torchlight app. There was a 2013 or 2014 Federal Trade Commission decision, which is actually hilarious, but also really grim reading. You know, this is an app that does one thing, which is shines a torchlight. And yet, when you look across all of the apps that were active at the time, you just see the most outrageous over collection of data, including location, tracking, preventing your device from sleeping, modify your system settings, view your Wi-Fi connections, and even take pictures and video. Why? Why would you need to do that? And so, you know, these companies, Facebook, the Torchlight providers, they're not alone. If any of you have done a DNA test online, you've agreed that the company will keep your DNA forever. And there's actually human rights case law to say that if that's done by law enforcement on a criminal database where an individual has no convictions, that's an infringement of your human rights. And yet we're doing this willingly. You know, I'm sure that the horrors of the UK COVID tracking app will come to light in the future, and I will regret saying anything positive about it. But so far, there's a lot about the choices that they're making about minimizing data and working closely with privacy regulators. I think too few private companies are making. And it shows that in theory, at least, it is possible to have a desired functionality, like helping to stop a pandemic, which I think we would all support, that can be achieved without being overly intrusive. There's a sort of unbridled, well, while you're at it, let's collect all the data approach in other sectors. Now, we can't just roll back the clock and ban things. Some of the questions were like, can we ban this? Regulation is starting to emerge in more than 40 countries have brought forward regulation, often aimed at the big platforms. But even the GDPR so far has done little to curb data collection and abuse by big platforms, while imposing a strong compliance burden on many other organizations that are never going to get close to processing data in the same way. I think we need to think creatively about how we live in an environment where our entire history, especially for you as younger people, you know, everything, your whole life, everything we've done, everywhere we've been, our likes, our relationships, our dislikes, our guilty pleasures, they are known to companies, to governments. And going back to Boris Johnson and our liberties, we've sort of been conditioned by now to surrender our liberties too cheaply, in my opinion, in return for likes, shares, and emojis. And every crisis furthers our step down the road. So our job now, before 5 o'clock UK, is to make sure that we can reclaim those liberties before it's too late.